2006. First of all, I welcome to the program Hetty Green. Miss Green lived from 1834 until 1916, and she's been known as the richest American woman in history and was often even called the Witch of Wall Street. Welcome, Miss Green, to our time, and we look forward to the interview today with you.
Thank you.
And our second guest is a person named Nellie Bly, who lived from 1867 until 1922. And she was the first woman journalist to achieve international fame in her time. We too welcome you very much, Miss Bly, to our program. And we look forward to talking with you about this series we have called Journey Through Time. And with that, I introduce Erna Reinhardt, who is our regular panelist, and she is the Director of Public Relations at North College, and she will commence today's questioning.
Nellie Bly and Hetty Green. Some of our viewers may not be real familiar with what you accomplished in your lifetime, so I'd like to start today's show with having each of you tell us a little bit about an overview of your life and maybe one or two things that you were the most famous for. So let's start with Nellie. Mm-hmm. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about your life.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Reinhardt. I was probably most famous for being the first woman investigative reporter. I started doing that when I was about 19 years old, and I was famous for doing undercover, like working in, I checked myself into an insane asylum once, and I posed as a unwed mother to expose the black market, baby market in New York City. And the other thing I was probably most noted for was that I went around the world in less than 72 days. That was back in 1889.
Excellent, and we'll get back to some more of some great stories of your lifetime in more detail in a few minutes. Hetty Green, same thing, a little overview of your life and what you were most famous for.
I was probably most famous for my shrewd business behavior, that I was called the Witch of Wall Street, and part of that came from wearing the same clothes most all my life and doing very economical living behaviors. And I was a female investor, which at that time, in my earlier years, the women didn't invest, women didn't work Wall Street. But I had an advantage because my father was going blind when I was 13, so I had to read the financial pages to him. So at 13, I started doing my own investments and became a millionaire.
Excellent. Okay.
I'll start with you, Miss Green. There's so many famous stories about how frugal you were. Share with us, I think that as you've come to visit in 2006, that you're now not shy to talk about the real Miss Green. Tell us some of the things that you did. Even though you had much wealth, you really lived almost like that you were in poverty.
Yeah, a lot of people say I was a pauper. You know, I think that it's the other people that are wrong because they're spending money so wastefully. For example, when you wash your skirt, do you throw your whole skirt into the can to wash it? Probably. I only wash the last 4 inches of my skirt because that's the only part that's dirty.
And therefore the skirt would last longer and the material wouldn't fade?
Well, I wouldn't waste water, too. And to heat water, I would never do that. I wouldn't heat water for my oatmeal. I put my oatmeal on the radiator. You know, a lot of people think I'm ridiculous at the things I do. On my 12th birthday, they went to put candles on my cake, and I insisted they didn't light the candles because we could reuse them. But what I really did is I put them back in the package and took it in for a refund after my birthday.
So as a young girl, you were always this way?
Oh, always, always. Yeah.
Now, from what I've read about your life, Harry, you had a son that was not like you, that he was a spender, wasn't he?
He was. Ned was, because I had a daughter and a son, and I entrusted my son running part of our estate. He had to prove himself first. So we had bought a railroad investment in Texas, and I sent him down there to prove himself. He started buying fishing resorts, investing in car racing activities, spending money on things that I would never spend my money on. He was a ladies' man. He had a prostitute living with him, which I can't believe my son would live with a prostitute. But you know, the more I think about it, it was a good idea, because he would never marry a prostitute, and therefore she could never control our family fortune. So I pretend like it's okay.
And so you did give him more money than you would have given yourself to spend?
He had enough control that he could spend money on. He was trying to prove himself, and I didn't approve of the ways he spent his money.
Miss Bly, you worked with a very, very famous other journalist. Share that relationship with us in your journalism work. Another famous owner of out of St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't you work with Pulitzer son?
Yes, yes, yes. Joseph Pulitzer gave me a job at the New York Globe, and it wasn't an easy way to get there. It was I had a background before I got there. I actually got my first reporting job because I was outraged at a article that was in the newspaper saying that women should stay in the home, and it was a travesty for the working women to be out in the workplace, and they should just stay at home and clean the house and take care of the children. Well, my mother had been working, and I'd been working for several years because my father had died, and so I wrote to the editor and told him that this was, that many women worked because they needed to work. And I signed it Little Orphan Girl. And he put a letter to the editor, and he said, with the man who wrote the letter responding to my editorial, please come forward because I'd like to give him a job. So at that time, my name was Pink. Pink Cochran was my nickname. Cochran was my God-given name. And so I went in there, and you can imagine a girl in pink coming up and 18 years old and saying that she wrote the letter, and he was so impressed that he gave me my first reporting job. And that was in Pittsburgh. And so I started reporting for him and doing some investigating one. And at that time, too, we weren't supposed to use our real names because it was unladylike for a woman to report. And so he was thinking of the song, and it was going through his head, and that's when I became Nellie Bly. He said, from now on, you'll be Nellie Bly, and that's how I lived the rest of my days as
So he
Nellie
really
Bly.
had a lot to do with your career taking off.
Right, yes, and so but then I started writing about things that were not popular with the advertisers. I started writing about the conditions in the factories and a few other things, and the advertising dollar, as you know, as in today, it runs the newspaper, and as the newspaper, the advertisers threatened to take their money away. So I was taken away from the jobs I really enjoyed and given to write about fashion shows and flower shows and extremely boring things. And so then I went off to Mexico and wrote about Mexico for about 6 months until the Mexican government kicked me out because they didn't like what I was writing about them, and returned. And then one day I returned and I got back to writing fashion shows and flower shows and bored, and so I just left this note on their desk. I just wrote this note. It says, DQ, I am off to New York, watch for me, Nellie Bly. And that's how I ended up. And I ended up in New York City, and Joseph Pulitzer hired me to be one of his reporters.
And of course, he was extremely successful, and therefore you were working for what turned out to be a very large newspaper empire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Erna Reinhardt.
Hetty Green, I'm interested in how you first came about being wealthy. Were you born into money? Was your family?
My family, back in about the 1830s, oil became a very prized investment on the East Coast, New England states. And my grandfather realized that and got into the business of getting oil not from the ground but from whales. There was a sperm whale that was sought after because the sperm whale had a cavity that had 500 pounds of pure oil. and when it touched the air, it felt like sperm. So they called it the sperm whale, and that's what the big rush was back in the 30s when my grandfather started, and he was one of the pioneers. So he became wealthy very quickly.
And wasn't there, I'm not sure if I have this right or not, but was there some controversy when your father died about who was going to inherit the money?
Yes, my father did not put me in charge of the will because I was a girl, and so males took over. I got a small amount of the inheritance, but then only got an allowance after that. There was two wills. Actually, there was my father's will, but there was also my aunt's will. My grandfather, when he made all the money, he split the will between my mother and her sister, Sylvia, and Sylvia was going to leave me her will. She was not married, but at the very end, her housekeepers and her house help convinced her to change the will. I found a document that said if anybody said that, it was false. And I took it to court. I fought it for 5 years, trying to get what belonged to my family. They claimed that I forged it, and I didn't. And I got reimbursed for some of my aunt's will, but not all of it.
And then share with us what some of your first investments were. What did you invest in early?
Invest in early was mostly just the stocks, Wall Street. Later, when the oil business started to peter down a little bit, my father then started doing real estate, and a lot of my financial gain came from the real estate later. I owned houses, apartments. I owned full blocks in New York. I made loans out to New York when they were going to have to lay off their police department. I had water brought in for Arizona, and so I made money by the real estate that people defaulted on. I would never buy real estate for full price. It was always defaulted real estate, and then I loaned it out and got even more money.
Excellent. And Nellie, share with us, I'm interested in what it was like to be on the staff of a huge New York paper. Were there other women that were working beside you, or was it a man's
Not
world?
at that time. There wasn't a lot of women reporters. And in fact, when I first went to work for the paper, things were starting to get a little dismal. That Americans we're a fairly new country at that time, and Americans weren't used to paying for their news. And so we had to drop our newspaper rate from a quarter to 15 cents a day, and still things were going a little badly. I did some investigating, reporting, and then someone at the newspaper had this idea that somebody should go around the world in 80 days to break the famous book by Jules Verne's about around the world in 80 days. And so they had this idea that somebody should try and do this. And somebody had sent a letter, and they were able to do it in 75 days. And so they said if a letter could make it around in 75 days, a person should be able to make it around in 75 days. And so, of course, I volunteered immediately. And people said, oh, no, you couldn't do it, because a woman traveling alone in 1889, I was 25 at the time, so traveling alone at 25 years of age, and woman, oh. And then I'd have way too much luggage, and it would take me too long to get to places, and I just wouldn't make it. But I convinced them that I should go. So I went, and I went around the world, and they set my goal for 75 days and set me up with a nice little itinerary, and off I took. And then while I was gone, they would run stories, and then people started following the stories, and there was contest about how, to guess the time to the second that I would arrive back in New Jersey. I started out in New Jersey. And then whoever won would get a free trip to Europe paid by the newspaper. So,
And was there some kind of a welcome home celebration for when you did come home?
oh yes. It was very exciting. As I went around, in fact, over in the European countries and the Asian countries, many people had not heard of me, so the welcome there was not as great. But once I arrived in San Francisco, there was a huge crowd for me in San Francisco, and I boarded a train and took off, and it looked like I was going to make my deadline. I ran into a snowstorm, and that's when Mr. Publius sent out a special train for me with only one car, so then I didn't have to worry about it. So he took me on a different route. And of course, when I arrived in New Jersey, there was a big crowd, very big welcome.
Great.
And you made it in how much time?
72 days. Let's say 72 days. Yeah, 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes and 15 seconds.
So you did better than even the goal at 75.
Right, yeah. My theory is that, energy rightly applied, you can accomplish anything.
Let me pursue another area with you, with your reporting. Among those investigative tasks that you took on, one of them was that you did, through the cooperation of certain people, check yourself into a mental institution. And when you came out, you reported on what you found. Give us some description of what you wrote about the conditions. And I assume when you do this kind of thing, there'd be some reaction from the public and there'd be some reform that would follow.
Right, and that would be, you're referring to Blackwell Island in New York City. And what I'd heard about the conditions, and so I posed as a woman from Cuba. And in fact, the newspaper even ran a story on me to kind of back that I was this woman from Cuba that was wandering in the streets. And they took me to the asylum to check me in. And I was checked in, and I kept telling the people that I was not crazy. And within 10 minutes, 2 doctors had decided that I was crazy. I learned very quickly it was very easy to get into an asylum and very difficult to get out. So there was one woman there, in fact, who the reason she was there was she had an affair, and her husband decided that she must be crazy if she had an affair, and so he just dropped her off, and so she was never released. There were several people in there that didn't speak English, and so, again, they assumed that if you didn't speak English, you must be crazy, so therefore we'll put you into the asylum. The conditions, we were given a meal of 5 prunes and weak tea for dinner. We were showered down in group showers and given one towel for about 12 people to share. There was people had open sores and stuff, and you just would cringe thinking about using that same towel with those people. And we were, during the day when we weren't working, they put us to work, but when we weren't working, we were just told to sit on a bench and stare at a wall. So you can imagine what would happen if you were put on a bench and stare at a wall. If you weren't crazy and coming in, you soon would become crazy. So, and at one point when I started to rebel, they tried to give me shots. They would try to give me medicine to calm me down, and when I took the medicine, and then I wait for them to leave, and then I would, vomit the medicine back up so it wouldn't take effect. And so after finally about 10 days, the attorney from the paper came and got me out. And they decided that we were crazy just by walking through every day. They'd say good morning to us, and just by the way we looked, the doctors would say, they'll still be crazy, let's keep them in here.
And then following your articles, what changes took place?
None.
None?
Yeah, they denied all reports.
They just denied
Yeah.
That had to be frustrating. But yet it's been recorded in history, and sometimes it takes a period of time, but later there would be reform.
Mm-hmm.
And now back to Miss Green. When you came to visit with us in our time, you presented before an audience here. And you walked back and forth, and you had a paper, and you kept hitting the paper in your hand, and you kept talking about it. I interpret you to be quite an aggressive person.
Mm-hmm.
And you, during that presentation, said that you had never apologized to anyone. Would you share your relationship toward human beings in relation to that?
I don't apologize. I make a decision, I go for it. I can remember one time a guy came on my property and he was chased by a cow, and he was so mad he came up to my door and he was yelling at me, and I didn't give him any sympathy, and I don't apologize for the cow. And he started throwing titles at me. I don't like titles either. And so I just told him, go tell the cow, and I shut the door on him. And that's what I do. I don't apologize. I don't like doctors, I don't like lawyers and people with titles. They just try to get every penny they can from you. And so, for example, doctors. My son had a sledding accident when he was young. I dress the way I do poorly because I can get into free clinics. And so
you would go to free clinics with all the money?
Absolutely. But they would just take all your money. So why would I do that? I wouldn't be able to believe in the way that I save money if I did that. So I would go to free clinics, try to do take care of him at home. He eventually lost his leg, and we had to buy a cork leg for him. And so the public got very cynical of me for those.
So with
some of
your
those behaviors.
frugal behavior, that could have cost him his leg?
That may have. I would have to admit that, but it wasn't that I didn't try to get him help. We went to clinics. In fact, we had a doctor one time feeling so bad, he actually had us coming to his home. But somebody told on me, and he threw us out.
So the word got out that you couldn't go to the free clinics.
I couldn't go to the free clinics, yeah.
Erna Reinhardt.
I want to go back to Nellie and have you share with us another one of your journalism experiences when you exposed some of the people that were working, I think, in the garment district or something similar to that, the sweatshop workers.
Oh, the sweatshop
Yes.
workers. Yes. I also exposed how they were women and children were being treated in the sweatshops. One of the other ones on that same area, the strikers. I was sent to Chicago. In fact, it was after I got back from my trip around the world. And if you can believe this, I got back from my trip around the world. I didn't receive any extra money, if you can believe that. I got no raise. I got no notoriety. And it was almost like I had just not even been out of New York City, let alone around the world. So that really upset me. And because I thought of all the papers that I had sold and all the reporting and the way I endangered my life. So I quit. I quit reporting and went on to do something else. But then I realized my love was in reporting. So I came and asked for my job back. And when I got my job back, I was sent to Chicago and to cover the strikes. And there I was going to cover the striking, of course, from the company's point of view, and I got there and I realized that the strikers were the ones that were in the right and the company was in the wrong, that money had been taken from them, their wages had been cut, and they were expected to live in the company housing, yet their wages were cut, but the rent was raised by the company and stuff. And so I exposed the different things of the strikers and took the side of the strikers instead of the company.
And how, with that kind of controversy, Nellie, were you able to keep a job? I read something about you that the newspapers that you worked for liked you because you sold stories, but they didn't always like the stories that you told or the stories that you exposed.
And
so
then
how was
that's
that
what
relationship?
quite often then that I was put back to the flower shows and the, covering different other areas that were considered more ladylike and, exposed less big companies and stuff that they like. So I think they like the selling of the papers, but they don't like the reduction in revenue. Yeah,
Right.
So
Right. And Hetty, I'm curious about what your marriage was like because you obviously were a powerful woman with a lot of money, and I know that you were married for a while.
You want to know something? I wore this every single day. He had 64 suits. 64 suits. So we started out with a little bit different value system. He bought this huge house. I had to partition off the rooms so the heat wouldn't cost so much. We decided early that I would control my money and he would control his. Well, what happened was the bank that we banked at, things got a little rough financially, and we worried that the bank was going to close. So I went down there to take my money out, and they wouldn't let me because their biggest holding was my account. Their biggest debt was his account. And so I got so mad, I went down there with bags and just told them to fill up the bags. And they gave me just partial of my money. And I was so mad that I left and started putting my money other places. You know what? The taxes on everything I owned was so high that from that moment on, I decided I wasn't going to have an address. I moved from state to state. I didn't have any address, so they couldn't tax me. I had no I didn't have any licenses that they could track. And I lived out my life doing that. In reflection back from 2006, I would guess that those states are fighting now for my estate, showing that I was resident at one point in their state.
I've got one more follow-up question. I'm curious, with all your wealth, did you have any social causes or anything like that that you were interested in that you supported financially?
Yes, toward the end, I started to donate to different causes. Children was a big issue with what I donated to. This is when I helped New York City and helped Arizona get their water in. I tried to do things with children. Most people give children candy and things like that. When a neighborhood child would come to my door, I'd give them a piggy bank. And I'd put $1 in it. And if they could come back the next week and have saved $1, then I'll put another $1 in their piggy bank. But I don't give candy and stuff like that, only the $1, and only if they can make money off of my money.
Excellent.
Ms. Green, you didn't quite finish the story. Did you divorce your husband?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But you know what? I married him because I thought he was a good businessman, but through having children and all of our experiences, I became very fond of him, and we kept a friendship until he died.
But your marriage was based more on economics than love.
In the beginning, but I would have to say toward the end, there was a fondness there.
On that note, I have to tell our viewers that two of our wonderful faculty in speech and communications have been portraying our characters today. First of all, Hetty Green was portrayed by Kathy Hostetter, who is in our speech and communications, and Nellie Bly was played by Annie McKinley. You both did a wonderful job, and I hope you will do characters again in the future. And the audience that you participated with just had a great time, and we thank you and we congratulate you for your performance. And these, after they broadcast the programs, they'll be cataloged in the library for future research by people. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again next week when we will move to show number 10 in our 11-week series on Journey Through Time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.